My 5-year-old son has an imaginary friend who tells him things that are going to happen, and they always come true. At first, it seemed normal to me because all children have imaginary friends, right? My sister had one named Captain Bubble until she was 7, and no one worried. My wife had an imaginary friend named Valola, who, according to her, taught her songs. It's a developmental phase. Psychologists say it's a sign of creativity and intelligence. But my son Mateo's imaginary friend wasn't like any of those. His name is Mr. Gray. Mateo started talking about him. He said it was going to rain a lot and not to take the red car. My wife and I looked at each other and played along. Oh, and why does Mr. Gray say that? Because he says the red car is going to have a big problem. The sky was completely clear. There was no chance of rain in the forecast. I laughed and went to work in the red car as always. That afternoon, a storm hit that wasn't in any forecast. The worst in 20 years, according to the news. It flooded 3 streets downtown, and a tree fell. Exactly in the parking lot where I left my car. When I got to the parking lot, my red car had a tree on top of it. Completely destroyed. If I hadn't gotten out 3 hours earlier, I would be dead. I got home that night, and Mateo was having dinner quietly. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Gray says he told you so." My wife looked at me, her eyes wide. I sat down and tried to process what had just happened. A 4-year-old warned me about a storm that meteorologists didn't predict, and about a tree that was going to fall exactly on my car. Coincidence, I told myself. It has to be a coincidence. The second warning. The second time was a month later. Mateo was playing in the living room, and suddenly he stood still, staring at the empty corner of the room. "Dad, Mr. Gray says that Grandma Elena is going to fall down the stairs tomorrow and hurt her hip. We have to tell her not to go down the stairs. Grandma Elena is my mother. She is 71 years old and lives alone." I called her out of obligation more than conviction. "Mom, be careful with the stairs." My mother laughed. "Oh, son, I've been going down those stairs for 40 years. I'm not going to fall." The next day at 3 in the afternoon, my mother fell down the stairs. She fractured her hip and was in rehab for 3 months. When I went to the hospital and came back home, Mateo was waiting for me at the door. "Mr. Gray says Grandma will be fine, but next time you should listen to him." That night, my wife and I had our first serious conversation about Mr. Gray. She was scared, but tried to rationalize it. "Children are perceptive," she said. "Maybe Mateo noticed your mom was losing her balance and processed it as a prediction. And with the car, maybe he saw something on TV about storms." I asked my wife, "Do you really think our 4-year-old analyzed his grandmother's balance pattern and predicted a hip fracture?" She didn't answer. The third warning. The third time was the one that cost me my sleep forever. Mateo came into our bedroom at 3 in the morning. He touched my face with his freezing little hand and said, "Dad, Mr. Gray is here and he wants me to tell you something." "What does he want to tell you, son?" "Not to me, Dad. He wants me to tell you. He says Mom's baby isn't going to make it." I sat bolt upright in bed. My wife was asleep next to me. She was 5 weeks pregnant. We hadn't told anyone. Not family, not friends, not work. Only she and I knew. Mateo couldn't have known because we deliberately didn't tell him. We wanted to wait until the second trimester. "How do you know Mom is having a baby?" "Mr. Gray told me. He says the baby is sick and that Mom is going to be sad, but later she'll be okay." I woke my wife and told her. She turned pale. The next day, she went to the doctor and they ran tests. The pregnancy was ectopic. If they hadn't caught it in time, it could have been a severe medical emergency. The doctor said we were very lucky to come in so early, that at 5 weeks, normally no one comes in to check. It wasn't luck. It was Mr. Gray. My wife lost the pregnancy, but the doctor said catching it early probably saved her life. When we returned from the hospital, Mateo was drawing in the living room. He looked at us and said, "Mr. Gray says not to be sad. He says you're going to have another baby next year and it's going to be a girl." I didn't want to ask him anything else. For the first time in my life, I was afraid of my own son. Not of Mateo, but of what was behind Mateo. Of who or what Mr. Gray was, and how he knew things that were impossible to know. The psychologist. We took Mateo to a child psychologist, Dr. Vargas, a woman with 30 years of experience who welcomed us with a professional smile and said, "Relax, imaginary friends are completely normal." I told her about the 3 predictions: the storm, the fall, the pregnancy. Her professional smile faded with each story. When I finished, Dr. Vargas looked serious in a way I didn't like. "Mr. Reyes," she told me, choosing her words carefully, "what you're describing is not consistent with a typical imaginary friend. Imaginary friends are creations of the child, extensions of their own psychology. They do not generate new information that the child couldn't possibly know. The pregnancy especially concerns me because there's no rational way a 4-year-old would have access to that information." "Then what is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. And that honesty scared me more than any diagnosis. "I want to see Mateo." The session with Mateo lasted an hour. Dr. Vargas sat him in a room with toys and asked him questions while my wife and I watched from behind a 2-way mirror. "Mateo, tell me about your friend." "Mr. Gray is my friend. He comes to visit me." "What does he look like?" "He is tall and gray, like his name. He has no face, but he has a voice. His voice sounds like when you put your hand on the window glass in winter. Cold, but soft." "Since when does he come?" "Always. Since before." "Since before what?" "Since before me." Dr. Vargas paused for a moment at that answer. "Since before you. What do you mean?" "Mr. Gray says he was here first. That the house is his. That he lived here before we arrived. And that we live here because he wanted us to. Our house. We bought it 6 years ago, before Mateo was born. It was an old house that we renovated. It was over 80 years old." A real estate agency sold it to us after buying it from the heirs of the original owner, who died there. Mateo continued talking with the naturalness of a child who doesn't understand that what he's saying is terrifying. Mr. Gray wakes me up sometimes at night, and he tells me things. He told me that before, in this house, there lived a family that had a dog named Saul, and that the man who lived here got sad one day, and he never got out of bed again. Dr. Vargas looked at me through the mirror. I knew what she was thinking because I was thinking the exact same thing. The previous owner died in that house. He was an older man who lived alone his last few years after his family left. The session ended and the doctor asked to speak to us alone. She sat in front of us and for the first time in her 30-year career said something that probably isn't in any manual. I cannot explain what your son is describing. I can tell you he shows no signs of any psychological disorder. It's not childhood schizophrenia. It's not a dissociative disorder. Mateo is a completely healthy child with normal emotional and cognitive development. What he tells me is consistent. Internally, it doesn't contradict itself. He's not making it up as he goes. He genuinely believes what he's saying, and the information he provides has turned out to be verifiable. Then what do you suggest? The doctor hesitated. This goes beyond my field, but if you ask for my personal, non-professional opinion, I'd say there is something in that house communicating with your son that knows things it shouldn't know. The basement. We drove home that night in silence. My wife drove because I couldn't concentrate. When we arrived, Mateo was asleep in his car seat. I carried him to his room, and when I laid him down, he opened his eyes for a second, half asleep, and said, Dad, Mr. Gray says you shouldn't be afraid of him. He says he looks after this family. But he says there's something under the house that you need to find before winter. He says if you don't find it before the first cold snap, someone in this house is going to go to sleep and not wake up. I closed his bedroom door with trembling hands. My wife was waiting for me in the hallway with her arms crossed. She looked at me and said, You heard him, right? Yes. What do we do? I don't know, but tomorrow I'm going to check under the house. Our house has a basement that we never go down to because when we bought it, the inspector said it was structurally unstable and it was best to seal it off. The entrance to the basement was in the backyard, covered by a concrete slab we put down the first year. Today is October 21st. The first cold snap arrives in 3 weeks according to the forecast. Mr. Gray said before the first cold. The next morning, I got up at 6, grabbed a shovel, and went to the backyard. Mateo was watching me from his second-floor bedroom window, in his dinosaur pajamas with his hand pressed against the glass. Next to him, in the window, the curtain moved as if someone else were watching. But Mateo was alone in his room. I started to dig around the concrete slab. I needed to get to the sealed basement. And according to Mr. Gray, whatever was down there, I needed to find it before the cold arrived, or someone in my family was not going to wake up. The concrete slab was heavier than I expected. I placed it myself 6 years ago with my brother-in-law Carlos, and I remembered us complaining about the weight then. Now I was alone with a shovel and a crowbar at 6 in the morning, and the thing felt like it had grown roots. It took me 40 minutes to break the seal around the edges. The whole time I could feel Mateo watching from the window. I didn't look up. I didn't want to see the curtain again. When the slab finally shifted, the smell hit me first. Not rot, not mold, not the usual damp basement smell I'd expected after years of being sealed. It was something older, like the inside of a drawer that hasn't been opened in decades. Dry paper and something faintly metallic underneath it. I pulled out my phone flashlight and pointed it down. Stone steps. 8 of them, leading into a room that was larger than I'd expected for a basement. The inspector had said it was structurally unstable, but standing at the top of those steps, I could see solid stone walls. Old, yes, but not crumbling, not dangerous. I went down. The basement was maybe 30 feet by 20. Low ceiling, stone floor. One old wooden shelf along the left wall, completely empty. A rusted metal hook in the ceiling that once held something. And in the far right corner, a wooden chest. Not large, maybe the size of a suitcase, and old enough that the wood had gone almost black with time. I crossed the room and crouched in front of it. There was no lock. Just a simple iron clasp, rusted but workable. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in what had once been cloth and was now just threads held together by habit, were documents, photographs, a small leather notebook. And underneath all of it, a folded architectural drawing, a floor plan of the house, hand-drawn in ink that had faded to brown. I took everything upstairs. My wife was awake by the time I spread the contents across the kitchen table. She stood across from me in her robe, coffee in hand, looking at the documents the way you look at something you're not sure you want to touch. The photographs were the easiest to process, which is saying something, because they weren't easy at all. They showed the house as it had been. The same structure, the same bones, but with different windows and an additional wooden structure in the backyard that no longer existed. A family stood in front of it in one photo. A man, a woman, 2 children, and a dog. The dog was a golden color. Light, almost white. I turned the photo over. On the back, in pencil, Familia Moreau, 1941, Sol Iyo, Sol. The dog Mateo had told Dr. Vargas about. The dog he said Mr. Gray remembered from when a family lived here before us. My wife set down her coffee. The leather notebook was harder to read because the handwriting was small and had faded, but it was in English, and after a few minutes I could follow it. It was a personal journal, dated entries running from 1944 to 1951. The man's name was Heinrich Moreau. He wrote about the house, about his work, about his children growing up and eventually leaving. The last entries from 1951 were shorter, more scattered. One line in particular stopped me. The cold comes early this year. I have checked the basement again. What I sealed there must not be found until the right person finds it. I read that line 3 times. My wife read it over my shoulder and said, What did he seal there? I looked at the empty wooden chest. I think we're looking at what he sealed there. Documents. And whatever he wanted the right person to find. She was quiet for a moment. Or a warning. I spent the rest of the morning going through everything slowly. The architectural drawing turned out to be the most interesting piece. It was the original floor plan of the house, but someone had added annotations in a different hand. Newer ink, probably added years after the original drawing. The annotations marked 3 spots in the house with small X symbols. One in the basement, one in what was now Mateo's bedroom, and one in the wall behind the fireplace in the living room. The basement X had a note next to it. Opened. Empty now. Meaning whoever had added the annotations had already been to the basement at some point and found nothing there. The fireplace X had a note. Sealed. Leave it. I stared at that for a long time. Our fireplace was original to the house. When we renovated, the contractor told us it was non-functional and that the flue had been sealed at some point. Not by us, not by the previous owner's heirs, but sometime earlier. We'd left it as a decorative element, put a grate in front of it, and never thought about it again. I was still looking at the drawing when my phone rang. It was my brother-in-law Carlos. Hey, your wife called me. She said you found something in the basement? Yeah. What kind of something? I hesitated. Carlos was the most practical man I knew. He was an engineer. He believed in what he could measure and calculate, and his threshold for what qualified as interesting was high and precise. I told him about the predictions months ago after the third one, and he'd listened politely and then said, "Kids are pattern recognition machines with bad data. He got lucky 3 times. Give it a few months and his predictions will start missing. Documents, old ones, from the original owner. Interesting? Anything valuable? I don't know yet. There's an old floor plan with markings. One of them points to a spot behind the fireplace." A pause. Behind the fireplace. Yes. You're not thinking of opening the fireplace. I'm thinking I should at least look. I could hear him exhale on the other end of the line. That exhale that meant he was calculating whether to push back or just go along with something he thought was a waste of time. "I'll come by after lunch," he said. "Don't start without me." I agreed and hung up. Mateo had come downstairs while I was on the phone. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his dinosaur pajamas, eating cereal, looking at the photographs spread across the table with the calm curiosity of a child who sees nothing alarming about any of this. He pointed at the family photograph. "That's Sol," he said, pointing at the dog. I sat down across from him, kept my voice even. "Did Mr. Gray show you that picture?" Mateo shook his head. "No, Mr. Gray just told me about Sol. Sol was nice. She liked to sleep under the stairs." He spooned another bite of cereal. "Mr. Gray says you found the chest. He says you found the right things, but not the important thing yet." "What's the important thing?" Mateo looked toward the living room, toward the fireplace. "He says it's cold in there. He says it's been cold in there for a long time." He looked back at me with those entirely untroubled 5-year-old eyes. "He says you should let it out before the cold comes from outside. He says when it gets cold outside and cold inside at the same time, the house gets confused." I looked at my wife. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands again. "And what happens when the house gets confused?" I asked. Mateo thought about it seriously, the way children think about things that adults would dismiss without consideration. "Mr. Gray says it forgets who's supposed to be here. And when a house forgets who's supposed to be here, it starts making room." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October sky was the flat gray of a day that couldn't decide whether to rain. "Making room for who?" my wife asked softly. Mateo shrugged with the total indifference of a child who has delivered a message and considers his job done. "For him," he said. "Mr. Gray says he doesn't want to be alone anymore." Carlos arrived at 1:30 with a toolbox and the expression of a man who has decided to be helpful while reserving the right to say, "I told you so" later. He was 6 years older than my wife, built like someone who'd played college football and then redirected that energy into home renovation projects. He set his toolbox on the living room floor, crouched in front of the fireplace, ran his hand along the sealed flue opening, knocked on the brick around the edges, and delivered his verdict in under 2 minutes. Sealed from the inside. Whatever's in there, someone put it there on purpose and then bricked it up from inside the firebox. He stood up and looked at me, which means at some point, someone climbed in there to do it, which is either dedication or desperation, depending on what they were hiding. "Can you open it? Without damaging the structure? Probably. Give me an hour." I showed him the floor plan with the annotations. He studied it with the careful attention he gave everything structural, and I watched his face go from professional interest to something more careful when he read the note beside the fireplace X. "Sealed. Leave it. Someone really didn't want this found," he said. "Someone else did," I said. "That's why they left the floor plan." Carlos looked at me for a moment. "You think the ghost left you a treasure map? I think the man who owned this house left instructions for whoever came after him. And I think that's not the same thing." He didn't argue. He put on his work gloves and started on the fireplace. My wife took Mateo to the park while we worked. She said it was because she didn't want him breathing construction dust, which was reasonable, and also, I think, because she didn't want him in the room when we opened it. She wasn't sure what we'd find. Neither was I. And there was something about having Mateo present for it that felt like involving him in something he was already too involved in. Before she left, she pulled me aside in the hallway. "Whatever is in there," she said, "I need you to think carefully before you touch it. Promise me." "I promise." She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, the way she did when she needed to believe that a promise was more than words. Then she took Mateo's hand and they left through the front door. I heard Mateo say, from the porch, clear as anything, "Mr. Gray says hi to Uncle Carlos." Carlos, who had heard it from the living room, said nothing. He picked up his chisel and started working. It took him 45 minutes, not an hour. The brick inside the firebox had been mortared hastily, functional, but not by a craftsman. Carlos removed 7 bricks and shone a flashlight into the gap. There's a space back here, he said, maybe 2 feet deep, like a small shelf built into the original wall. He reached in. I watched his expression. He pulled out a metal box. The size of a shoebox, the type that might once have held tools or medicine, latched shut with a simple clasp, similar to the chest from the basement. He handed it to me and I set it on the coffee table. We both looked at it for a moment. You open it, Carlos said. I opened it. Inside, resting on a layer of old newspaper, were 3 things. The first was a folded letter, handwritten, addressed to no one. The second was a small glass vial, sealed with wax, containing what looked like dried herbs or plant matter. And the third was a photograph, similar in style to the family photo I'd found in the basement, but this one showed only the house. No people. Taken from the street, straight on. And in the upstairs window, the window of what was now Mateo's bedroom, there was a figure. Tall. Indistinct. The quality of the photograph made it impossible to tell if it was a trick of light or an actual person, but the shape was there. Tall and slightly blurred, as if it had moved during the exposure. Gray. Carlos looked at it for a long time and then put it face down on the table. I unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages, written in the same hand as the journal from the basement. Heinrich Moreau, dated October 1951. I read it aloud to Carlos because my hands weren't entirely steady, and reading out loud gave me something to focus on. The letter explained everything and nothing at the same time, in the way that explanations sometimes make things more complicated instead of less. Heinrich wrote that when he bought the house in 1938, it came with what he called a presence. Not malevolent, he was careful to say, not a threat, but aware. It knew things. It communicated through his youngest daughter, who was 4 years old when they moved in. She would tell him things the presence had shared with her. Warnings, mostly. Small ones at first, then significant ones. The presence, he wrote, seemed to understand the family's well-being as its own responsibility. But there was a problem. The presence drew strength from the cold. Winter, specifically. When the temperature dropped below a certain point, what Heinrich described as its boundary, the line between whatever it was and the physical world, became thinner. During the coldest weeks of the year, his daughter stopped sleeping, started walking through the house at night, started saying things in a voice that wasn't entirely her own. Heinrich had consulted people he called practical men of faith, he didn't specify who, and they had given him the vial. The contents, he wrote, when burned in the lowest point of the house at the start of winter, would thicken the boundary, would remind the presence of what it was and what it wasn't, would protect the family during the months when the cold made the walls between things thin. He had done it every winter for 13 years. It had worked every winter for 13 years. The last entry in the letter was different from the rest. The handwriting was shakier. I am not well enough to do it this final winter. My children are gone, and there is no one to pass this to. I am sealing the vial where the house will keep it safe. Whoever finds this, do not be afraid of what lives here. It is not evil. It is only old and lonely, and it does not fully understand the difference between belonging and keeping. Burn the contents of this vial in the basement before the first hard freeze. Light it, leave it, do not stay. And tell your child that it will be all right. Tell your child. Carlos and I sat in silence for what felt like a long time. He was the one who spoke first. Carlos, who believed in load-bearing walls and moisture readings and structural reports. Carlos, who had said, give it a few months and his predictions will start missing. Carlos, who had come here today as a favor and a formality and nothing more. When's the first hard freeze? He asked. His voice was level, but something behind it wasn't. I checked my phone. Forecast says October 31st, maybe November 1st. He looked at the vial. That's 9 days. Yes. And if we don't do it. It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. Mateo said the house forgets who's supposed to be here. I picked up the photograph, looked again at the figure in the upstairs window. And then it starts making room. Carlos picked up the vial and turned it in his hands, examining it the way he examined everything, methodically, without drama, as if he were taking measurements. Then he set it down carefully on the letter, on top of Heinrich Moreau's shaky final handwriting. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. It was the most frightened I'd ever heard him sound. That evening, after my wife came home and I told her everything, and she read the letter twice and held the photograph for a long time without speaking. After all of that, after Mateo was in bed and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the kitchen with the metal box in front of me and the vial beside it. I thought about Heinrich Moreau doing this same thing every October for 13 years. An old man, alone in this house by the end, going down those stone steps with something small in his hand, buying his family one more winter. I thought about how he'd run out of winters eventually. How he'd sealed everything away and written his letter and trusted the house to keep it for whoever came next. I thought about Mateo at the window that morning, watching me dig, his hand pressed against the glass, the curtain moving next to him in a room where he was alone. Since before me, Mateo had told Dr. Vargas. Mr. Gray says he was here first. And I thought about that first morning, 6 years ago, when my wife and I had walked through this house before we bought it. How she had stood in the middle of the living room and said, without any particular reason, this house feels like it's been waiting for someone. How I'd laughed and said that was just what old houses felt like. How the realtor had smiled in that practiced way realtors smile when they know not to say anything. Now I understood what the house had been waiting for. Not us. Not specifically. A child who could hear it. We had 9 days, and I used the first 3 doing what I always do when I'm scared. I researched. I'm an architect by trade. My entire professional life is built on the principle that if you understand the structure of something, you can work with it safely. So I looked. I found Heinrich Moreau in the county records. Born 1891, Immigrated 1936, purchased the house 1938, died October 1951, weeks after writing that letter. His youngest daughter was named Clara, 4 years old when they moved in. I found her in a 1940 census entry, then nothing. The family had left before he died. He'd stayed alone, which matched exactly what Mateo had told Dr. Vargas. Clara Moreau, married name Voss, was 89 years old and living in a care facility 40 minutes north of us. I called. She called back within 2 hours. Her voice was clear and sharp in the way very old people's voices sometimes are. Like everything soft had already burned away, leaving only the essential. I told her what I'd found. When I mentioned the vial, she went quiet for a moment. You have it, she said. Not a question. Yes. Then listen carefully, because my father should have told us this himself and didn't. She spoke for 20 minutes. I wrote everything down. The presents, what Mateo called Mr. Gray, what Clara as a child had called Der Alte, the old one, was not dangerous in itself. It communicated through children because children's minds were, as she put it, less defended. Every winter without the ritual, it would expand. Not violently. Like a tide coming in, slow and indifferent, filling available space. It didn't understand that the space it was filling was already occupied by people who needed to breathe and sleep and remain present in their own lives. The people in the house would start feeling heavy, distant, like they were fading slowly. Her father had performed the ritual every winter for 13 years. It worked every year. The vial's contents, burned in the lowest point of the house, thickened what she called the boundary, the line between what the presence was and what it wasn't. It reminded it of its place. It kept the family safe through the cold months when that line grew thin. The last winter before he started the ritual, Clara said, her mother had stopped eating, her older sister had stopped speaking, and Clara herself had begun dreaming in a language she didn't recognize. They left in 1943 because her mother never fully recovered. Her father stayed. He understood. He maintained the boundary alone until he couldn't anymore. One person goes down, she told me. Less for it to focus on. Light it and leave. Don't speak to it. Don't ask it anything. If it tries to communicate through your son in those final minutes, tell him to cover his ears and think about something warm. Is it going to hurt him? No. It will just try to hold on to what it knows. A pause. It is not evil. I need you to understand that. It kept our family safe for 13 years. It warned my father about things that would have hurt us. It is only very old, and it does not experience time the way we do. When it reaches too far, it is not trying to harm. It simply forgets that some things need to remain separate. I thought about Mateo saying he doesn't want to be alone anymore. No, Clara said softly when I told her. It never did. October 30th. One day before the projected freeze. My wife took Mateo to her mother's house for the day. At the door, he looked back at the house once in a way that made her reach down and hold his hand more tightly. He went without argument. He'd been waking at night again, standing in the hallway, listening to things we couldn't hear. The night before, he'd found me in the kitchen and said, Mr. Gray knows you're going to do something. He says he's going to miss talking to me. I'd crouched down to his level. He can still talk to you, just not as loudly. Mateo thought about it. Like when Grandma came back from the hospital but she was a little bit less? Yes, like that. He'd accepted it and gone back to bed. I'd sat on the edge of his mattress until his breathing slowed, then stood, touched the cold window glass, and watched the frost beginning to form on the outside of the pane. The house was running out of time. Carlos sealed the backyard slab behind me once I was through. I went down the stone steps alone, vial in one hand, matches in the other. Clara was right about the pressure. Behind the eyes, like the first suggestion of a headache. Like the air in the basement had more weight than air should have. The room felt smaller than it had 4 days ago. Not measurably. But I felt the walls closer, the ceiling lower, the corner where the empty wooden shelf stood colder than the rest of the room by several degrees. Not a draft. An attention. I didn't speak. I didn't look directly at the corner. I broke the wax seal on the vial, emptied the contents onto the stone floor, dried herbs, something resinous, something I didn't recognize, and struck a match. The pile caught immediately. Quiet. A low, steady flame with smoke that rose straight up and smelled like pine and something older than pine. I turned without looking back and walked to the stairs. Behind me, nothing dramatic. No sound, no movement, no voice. Only the soft burn of the flame. And then, just before I reached the top step, something else. A sound at the edge of hearing, barely there. That was almost a sigh. Patient. Vast. Like something very old settling back into its proper depth after a long time of reaching upward toward the light. Carlos sealed the slab. We stood in the backyard in the October cold, and neither of us spoke for a while. Is that it? He finally said. That's it. He looked at the sealed concrete, then at the sky, then at the house. It's the same house, he said. Meaning, nothing had changed visibly. Meaning, he'd half expected something to change visibly. It's the same house, I agreed. That's the point. That night, for the first time in 4 days, Mateo slept straight through until morning. No hallway, no listening, no cold little hand on my face at 3 a.m. When he woke up, he came downstairs for breakfast and sat at the table with the uncomplicated cheerfulness of a child who has no weight on him. I put cereal in front of him. He ate 3 bites and then looked up. Dad. Yeah, bud. Mr. Gray says thank you. I set down the bowl I was holding, sat across from him, looked at my son in the morning light, 5 years old, dinosaur pajamas, milk on his upper lip, and felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't realized I'd been holding tight for months. Tell him he's welcome, I said. Mateo nodded seriously and went back to his cereal. Outside, the first freeze of the season arrived that night, right on schedule. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. The windows fogged. The old house creaked and settled the way old houses do when the cold comes, finding its familiar shape against the weather. Inside, everyone slept. For 3 weeks after the ritual, nothing happened. That sounds anticlimactic. I know. After everything, the storm, the hip fracture, the pregnancy, the chest, the letter, Clara Voss, the basement, 3 weeks of nothing sounds like a deflation. But if you've spent months living in a house that feels like it's breathing slightly out of sync with you, 3 weeks of silence feels like the first clean air after a long fever. We slept. Mateo played. My wife laughed at something on television on a Tuesday night, and I sat there listening to it like it was the best sound I'd heard in a year. Mr. Gray, as far as we could tell, was still there. Mateo would occasionally glance at an empty corner of the room, with that particular quality of attention that meant he was aware of something we weren't. But he didn't relay messages. He didn't wake at night. He didn't press his hand against cold glass and watch things we couldn't see. The boundary was holding. Then, on a Saturday morning in late November, Mateo came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and stood in the middle of the floor with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the calm relay mode of a child passing along a message. Something more considered, like he was deciding whether to tell me something. "Dad," he said. "Mr. Gray wants to say something, but he says it's the last thing for a long time. He says after this he's going to be quiet and I can just be a regular kid." I set down the coffee pot, crouched to his level. "Okay," I said. "What does he want to say?" Mateo was quiet for a moment, listening to something. Then he looked at me with those clear, untroubled eyes and said, "He says Mom's baby is going to be fine this time. He says she already knows, but she's scared to hope. He says to tell her she can hope." I didn't move for several seconds. My wife was 8 weeks pregnant. We had found out 6 days ago. We hadn't told anyone, not family, not Carlos, not Dr. Vargas. We had decided, after losing the last pregnancy, to wait until we were certain, to protect ourselves from hoping too much too soon. Mateo could not have known. I stood up slowly. My son was already moving toward the living room, toward his toys, the conversation apparently complete in his mind. At the doorway, he stopped and looked back once. "Mr. Gray says he picked us," Mateo said. "He says he waited for a long time and he picked a family that would listen. He says most people don't listen." He paused. "He says thank you for listening, Dad." Then he went to play with his toys, and that was that. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed next to my wife. She was reading, or trying to. The book was face down on her lap, and she was looking at the ceiling the way she'd been doing a lot in the past 6 days. That particular look of someone carrying hope they're not sure they're allowed to have. I told her what Mateo had said. She didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was very quiet. "He can't know that." "No," I said. "He can't." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. Not quite. "Do you believe it?" I thought about the storm, the tree on the red car, my mother's hip fracture, the ectopic pregnancy caught at 5 weeks because a 4-year-old woke us at 3 in the morning with a freezing hand on my face. I thought about a chest sealed in a basement for 70 years, a letter written by a man who had made his peace with something vast and old and lonely. I thought about Clara Voss's voice on the phone, clear as a bell, saying it is not evil, it simply forgets that some things need to remain separate. "Yes," I said. "I believe it." She reached over and took my hand and held it, and we sat there together in the November morning, while downstairs our son played with his toys, and the house settled quietly around us, and whatever lived in its walls kept its distance and kept its watch, the way it had been keeping watch since long before any of us arrived. In March, our daughter was born. We named her Elena, after my mother. She was healthy and loud and perfect, and when we brought her home from the hospital and laid her in her crib for the first time, Mateo stood at the doorway of her room and looked at her for a long time with an expression I recognized. That particular quality of attention. That listening. Then he looked at the corner of the room. Then he smiled. "Mr. Gray likes her," he said. "I've thought a long time about what to make of all of it. I'm an architect. My life is measurements and load calculations and the documented behavior of physical materials. I believe in what I can verify. And I cannot verify any of this in any way that would satisfy a scientist or a skeptic, or honestly, a previous version of myself. What I can tell you is what I know. I know that a 5-year-old warned me about a storm that meteorologists didn't predict. I know that same child told me my wife was pregnant before we told him, and that the pregnancy was in danger, and that catching it early probably saved her life. I know that a man named Heinrich Moreau loved his family enough to spend his last years alone in a cold house, performing a ritual every October, so that something ancient and lonely wouldn't swallow the people he couldn't protect anymore. I know that he trusted the house to keep his instructions safe for whoever came next, and that whatever the house is, it did. And I know this. The thing that most people call frightening in this story, the presence, the predictions, the voice behind the curtain, never once tried to harm us. Every single thing it communicated was meant to protect us. It warned us. It prepared us. It chose us, Mateo said, because we would listen. We almost didn't. The tree would have fallen on me if I had taken the red car. My mother would have fractured her hip without warning if I had dismissed the second prediction. My wife could have died if I had rolled over at 3 in the morning and gone back to sleep instead of waking her. I used to think that the rational response to the unexplainable was to ignore it until it went away. To stay in the lane of what makes sense, what can be measured, what fits into the framework of how the world is supposed to work. What I understand now is that the framework is just a map. And like any map, it leaves things out. Some things are outside the map. Some things have been there since long before the map existed. That doesn't make them wrong or dangerous or something to be afraid of. Sometimes it just means they've been waiting a very long time for someone to stop walking and listen. We listened. And everyone in my house is alive because of it.